He climbed a mountain, and with simple words, exposed everything the world tries to hide. Have you ever felt crushed by unattainable standards? Have you ever carried a heavy heart, trying to be strong in a world that only values appearance, status, and control? Then perhaps you are ready to hear the one thing that continues to turn the world upside down today. There, before a weary and silent crowd, Jesus did not offer easy comfort. He offered the truth. A truth that challenges, that breaks masks, that disarms pride. Each word spoken on that hill still carries fire, still confronts hearts, still transforms destinies. But be careful, hearing these words can leave you breathless. Because what you are about to hear is not just a teaching, it is a calling. And if you have the courage to stay until the end, you may discover that the rock on which life is built was closer than you imagined. Few words spoken aloud have traversed as much time and space as those uttered by a Galilean carpenter on a hillside forgotten by empires. No palace, no cathedral or synagogue consecrated that moment. The floor was made of dirt, the pulpit improvised, the audience composed of faces marked by sun, weariness, and hope. What could be so extraordinary about an open-air speech that did not promise revolt, did not mobilize armies, did not offer guarantees of security or prosperity? The question seems even more perplexing when you consider the context. Rome controlled everything there was to control. Violence was institutionalized, religion was deeply tied to power, and misery was a constant presence in markets, homes, and fields. Those who lived on the margins knew that it was not enough to simply survive. It was necessary to keep the soul intact. But how to do this in a world that celebrated the strong, rewarded the cunning, and forgot the pure? Then a voice arises that is like no other. It promises glory not to those who conquer, but to those who mourn. It exalts not those who conquer by the sword, but those who make peace. It does not praise accumulation, but calls the empty spirit blessed. This voice not only proposes a new ethic, but challenges the foundation of all the old ones. The answer to the initial question about the power of this discourse lies precisely in its disobedience to expectations. It does not appease the hunger for revenge or soothe the thirst for control. On the contrary, it displaces everything that the world considers sensible, and therein lies its lasting power. In times when everything is calculated in utility, where someone's worth is measured by impact, by number, by influence, hearing that the meek shall inherit the earth is not only confusing, but disarming. This teaching was not born from theory, but from the observation of a wounded reality. He is born where pride collapses, where arrogance finds no ground to stand on. It was not designed to win theological debates, nor to serve as decoration on pictures or in diaries. It was designed to be lived. Therefore, instead of extolling the rituals that impress, he draws attention to what pulses within, where the heart meets the truth, and there are no more masks that can stand. The curious thing is that, despite its simplicity, no other set of words has been analyzed, quoted, translated, and debated as much as these. The Sermon on the Mount appears as a mirror. Before it, no one remains neutral. Either they move away to maintain the illusion of strength intact, or they come closer to be deconstructed and reconstructed. It is not content with spectators. It provokes choice, repositioning, repentance, transformation. Amidst this narrative, there is a purposeful discomfort, because what is proclaimed, there is not an unattainable ideal, nor an ethic reserved for irreproachable saints. It's a summons, not to aesthetic perfection, but to radical sincerity. A spirituality that is measured not by appearances, but by the willingness to be shaped. The power of these words lies in the fact that they are not just beautiful, they are dangerous. Dangerous for any system that relies on domination, appearance, and performance. Dangerous because, when taken seriously, they change relationships, destroy walls, and challenge privileges. And precisely for this reason, they remain relevant. In a society saturated with empty speeches and easy promises, these words do not sound like slogans, but like anchors. The questions that echoed on that hillside still cry out today. Who are the truly happy? What does it mean to be righteous? How do we deal with the enemy? What is the real value of life? The Sermon on the Mount doesn't just offer answers, it reframes the questions. And in doing so, it destabilizes what seemed unquestionable. That is why, even in the face of technological advances, social revolutions, and the countless philosophical treatises that have emerged since then, these words continue to haunt us. Because where there is a thirst for meaning, there they make themselves heard. Where there is hunger for justice, there they become food. Where there is fear, confusion, chaos, there they reveal themselves as solid rock underfoot. Thus begins a journey through truths that do not surrender to time. A journey towards a vision of life that is independent of circumstances. There are no promises of comfort, but there are real promises. And the truth, when it finds space in a willing heart, not only instructs, it transforms. On that silent hill in Galilee, as the dust still settled at the feet of the crowd and eyes searched for meaning in the face of the man who had just sat down, what came next was no ordinary teaching. Jesus began his speech with a set of statements so foreign to the prevailing logic of the time that to those listening they sounded almost like a provocation. He used the word blessed, and what came after that word broke with everything those people believed about what it meant to live a good, blessed, or happy life. The first people to hear those phrases lived under the weight of a system that exalted strength, ritual purity, and moral appearance. They were citizens of a land dominated by the Roman Empire since the year 37 before Christ, when Herod, supported by Rome, came to control Judea. There, power was imposed by swords, and religion was led by leaders who transformed faith into rules. In this scenario, saying that the poor in spirit were the ones who possessed the kingdom, or that those who mourn would be comforted, was more than unusual. It was a direct blow to the foundations of a culture shaped by spiritual and social meritocracy. When Jesus declares that the meek will inherit the earth, he contradicts centuries of military expectations. The inheritance belonged to warriors, kings, and conquerors. But there, before peasants, the sick, widows, fishermen, and the marginalized, Jesus said that meekness, understood as self-control, patience, and humility, was the true path to possessing what matters. And not only that, it was the legitimate path to inheriting what has always been reserved for the victors. Today, scholars agree that the Sermon on the Mount, recorded around the year 70 AD in the Gospel attributed to Matthew, represents one of the most complete expressions of Jesus' ethical thought. In the Beatitudes, he does not present unattainable goals, but rather character traits that define the type of person God values. And surprisingly, this valorization goes against what ancient and modern societies celebrate. If yesterday it was religious position or social status, today it is professional success, digital visibility, control of the narrative. The revolution is in reversing the criteria. It is no longer the outside that validates the inside. It is the heart, with its exposed weaknesses, that becomes the new center of spirituality. Those who mourn, those who hunger for justice, those who practice mercy, those who keep their hearts pure, those who promote peace, and those who are persecuted for doing what is right, they are all called blessed. The term, far from being romantic, carries a profound meaning. It is a state of blessing recognized by God, even when the world seems to see no value in it. In doing so, Jesus unmasks the illusions of apparent strength. In an empire where the centurion was a symbol of power, he says that true authority lies with those who do not need to dominate. In a culture where purity was associated with a rigorous ritual system, he says that a clean heart, which acts with sincerity and not duplicity, is what allows us to see God. In a context where justice was manipulated by those who had influence, he declares that those who hunger and thirst for justice, not those who accommodate or benefit from injustice, are the ones who will truly be satisfied. This reversal of values is so radical that it remains uncomfortable. Nowadays, when statistics indicate that more than 800 million people still live in extreme poverty, and when violence, greed, and individualism shape political and economic decisions, the announcement that the merciful are the blessed ones sounds like an affront. The logic of the market, of competitiveness, and of self-preservation has no place in this discourse. Jesus' proposal does not fit into the mold of a spirituality that seeks comfort. It challenges, demands inner confrontation, and proposes renunciation of the ego. The beauty of the Beatitudes lies precisely in this shock. They do not offer shortcuts. They offer direction. They do not cover up pain, but embrace it. They do not call suffering a blessing, but reveal that there is a safe place, even in vulnerability. Jesus does not exalt sadness, but promises comfort to those who do not deny pain. He does not glamorize persecution, but affirms that being mistreated for doing what is right is a sign that one is on the path to the kingdom. Each sentence on that list is an invitation to reinterpret one's own existence, a call to look within and realize that what the world despises may actually be what God values. A proposal to live with an exposed heart, with an available soul, with the awareness that the true value of a life is not in what is accumulated, but in what is allowed to be transformed. In presenting the Beatitudes, Jesus not only pointed out which attitudes reflect the values of the kingdom, but he set the stage for an even more profound change. He was leading his listeners into something few expected, a complete overhaul of what it means to be righteous. It was no longer about following rules, repeating traditions, or appearing pure. The focus was shifting inward. The focus was no longer on observable behavior, but on intentions, thoughts, and motivations that no one else could see. If this message is making sense to you, write Amen in the comments. This shows me that you are following and also helps more people find this content. In Jesus' day, righteousness was often confused with outward conformity. The Mosaic Law, given centuries earlier, had become the foundation of the Jewish people's religious and cultural identity. Over time, however, this legal framework became surrounded by layers of interpretations, requirements, and customs that eventually led to a spirituality centered on performance. The Pharisees, for example, were respected for their dedication to the law, but Jesus often criticized them for maintaining an appearance of righteousness while neglecting love, compassion, and truth. The problem was not the law itself, but the superficiality with which it was applied. The radical nature of Jesus' teaching is evident when he says, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." This phrase, repeated several times throughout the discourse, does not represent a rejection of the law, but a call to go beyond it. He does not propose harsher rules, but rather a deeper path. It is not enough to not kill. It is necessary to confront the hatred that silently settles within the breast. It is not enough to avoid adultery. It is necessary to deal with the desires that corrupt the gaze and darken the soul. In other words, the root is as important as the fruit. This type of justice goes against any model based on control or fear. It does not arise from pressure to obey, but from an inner transformation that spontaneously changes the way we live. The central idea is simple but powerful. There is no point in adjusting our behavior without addressing the dispositions of our heart. Because the heart is the source of our actions, it is where we define who we are. And when the heart is committed to good, justice ceases to be a burden and becomes a natural expression of our new consciousness. Contemporary studies in moral psychology reinforce this point. Research shows that sustainable ethical behaviors are linked to identity and intrinsic motivation, not external surveillance. This means that virtuous practices tend to last when they are aligned with authentic personal values. Jesus, 2 millennia earlier, already pointed to this principle. He spoke of coherence, of integrity, of a type of life that does not depend on applause, but on conviction. This inner justice also redefines the relationship with others. When we understand that a person's value is not in their religious performance, but in the dignity they carry by existing, it becomes impossible to sustain contempt, resentment, or superiority. Judgment gives way to empathy. Rigidity dissolves into grace. Ego gives way to service. And this becomes visible not in grand speeches, but in simple gestures, in the way we listen, forgive, and react to the mistakes of others. Jesus also introduces a disruptive element when teaching about forgiveness, not as an optional virtue, but as an essential criterion of justice. He connects the forgiveness that is received with the forgiveness that is offered. It is as if he were saying, it is only possible to fully receive grace when one is willing to share it. And this has practical implications. It means that holding grudges, nurturing resentment, cultivating divisions, all of this not only hurts others, but also blocks one's own spiritual path. The transformation of the heart, however, does not occur through willpower or solitary effort. It depends on openness, on a willingness to be molded. It involves admitting one's own limitations, recognizing areas of blindness, accepting that there are contradictions within oneself that need to be healed. It is an ongoing process, sometimes painful, but liberating. Because as the interior is purified, relationships become more authentic, commitments become firmer, and faith ceases to be theory and becomes incarnate life. With this, the concept of justice ceases to be punitive and becomes restorative. It is no longer about complying with a list of prohibitions, but about allowing the truth to transform itself. It is no longer a question of avoiding error for fear of punishment, but of choosing good out of love for one's neighbor and reverence for the Creator. And along this path, each attitude gains new weight, because it becomes a reflection of an inner reality that has been deeply touched. By delving into the human interior and confronting the hidden intentions that shape our actions, Jesus takes his message into even more disconcerting territory. After questioning appearances and calling for a transformation of the heart, he moves on to a principle that destabilizes any ethics based on reciprocity or merit. He affirms that true love is not limited to those who treat us well. It goes beyond that. It demands compassion, even for those who reject, betray, offend, or cause us pain. This idea was not only new to those who listened to him at that time, it still profoundly challenges human logic today. In the Jewish tradition, the commandment to love one's neighbor was already consolidated in the writings of Leviticus. However, this love was generally understood as a commitment to the community, to those who shared the same faith, history, and values. When Jesus deliberately includes the enemy within the scope of this love, he breaks an unspoken limit. He transforms the act of loving into something unconditional and non-reactive. It is impossible to ignore the context. Jesus spoke in an occupied land where Roman soldiers could impose public humiliations, levy unfair taxes, and attack without explanation. In addition, religious groups were in constant conflict with each other, and the population was divided by political, cultural, and religious tensions. Saying that it was necessary to pray for those who persecuted, bless those who insulted, and turn the other cheek was not only counterintuitive, it was dangerous. To many, it sounded like submission to evil, weakness, or a loss of dignity. But what Jesus was proposing was not passivity. It was resistance of a different kind, a resistance that does not return evil in kind, but disarms it at its root. He is not suggesting that injustice be ignored, but that it be responded to in a way that does not perpetuate its cycle. Love for one's enemy, in this case, is a gesture of rupture. It prevents hatred from reproducing itself. It interrupts the chain of violent reactions and opens space for reconciliation to become possible, even if not guaranteed. This love is based on God's character. Jesus associates this practice with the way the Creator acts. God makes the sun rise on the good and the bad, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. He does not distribute his care based on each person's moral performance. The divine nature is generous, patient, and all-encompassing. By calling his listeners to imitate this pattern, Jesus redefines what it means to be a child of God. It is not an identity obtained through lineage or religiosity, but through a way of acting that reflects the essence of the Father. This idea connects directly to the theme of judgment, because judgment, when born of pride or comparison, is a disguised form of denying grace. It assumes that one has the authority to measure another's worth without acknowledging one's own shortcomings. Jesus confronts this with an almost comical image: someone trying to remove a speck of sawdust from another's eye while carrying a plank in their own. The hypocrisy is not just in the act of judging, but in the blindness it reveals. Here, the teaching becomes profoundly practical. Before correcting someone, it is necessary to confront one's own shadows. Before pointing out the mistakes of others, one must deal with what is misaligned within oneself. The problem is not in discerning right from wrong, but in the attitude with which one does so. Correcting without humility, accusing without compassion, reprimanding without recognizing one's own weaknesses, all of these destroy rather than restore. This is where love differs from any other force. It does not cover up a mistake, but chooses mercy. It does not ignore what has been done, but insists on the dignity of the other. It does not depend on the response of the recipient, because it is born from the decision to be consistent with one's own transformation. The love that Jesus teaches is active, concrete, and demands presence. To love is not to feel. It is to act with kindness, even in the face of hostility. It is to maintain one's own dignity without denying the dignity of others. This call involves a deconstruction of social structures based on favoritism, exclusion, and rivalry. It challenges the logic of the group, of protecting one's fellow human beings, and of dehumanizing others. And it proposes an ethic that begins in the intimacy of the heart, but manifests itself in the way we respond to contempt, rejection, and conflict. This proposal continues to sound outrageous. In a world marked by polarization, where opposing opinions quickly turn into enmity, the idea of loving those who think differently seems unrealistic. But it is precisely in this scenario that this teaching becomes more necessary. Because it is not about agreeing with everything or tolerating abuse. It is about keeping your heart whole, of not allowing the evil of others to determine who you are. By expanding the vision of unconditional love and the suspension of judgment, Jesus leads the reflection to another vital dimension of existence, that in which we trust, that which we value, where the true sense of security lies. From this point on, he begins to directly confront the relationship between concern, desire, and faith. What seems like a new topic is, in fact, a logical consequence of what has already been said. Because if the heart has been transformed and justice is no longer an external spectacle, then what truly occupies the soul becomes even more evident. Jesus points to treasure as a symbol of inner focus, not as a physical object, but as something that attracts, consumes energy, and defines choices. Where the treasure is, there the heart is also. This principle is simple but profound, because it is not just about money or possessions, but about everything that occupies the center of attention: reputation, control, success, approval, security. Each person builds some kind of accumulation, whether material, emotional, or symbolic, and begins to protect this accumulation as if their identity depended on it. In criticizing the accumulation of earthly treasures, Jesus does not devalue effort or responsibility. It reveals the risk of basing one's life on something that cannot be guaranteed. Riches can disappear, goods deteriorate, possessions are vulnerable to time, to loss, to change. The value that seemed solid turns out to be ephemeral. The proposal is not to abandon practical life, but to shift priorities. Investing in what is eternal does not mean denying the present, but rather rooting yourself in something that remains even when everything around you changes. In this teaching, Jesus addresses a universal human concern: anxiety. In ancient times, anxiety revolved around survival. There was fear of tomorrow, of scarcity, of instability. Today, even with technological advances and more complex security systems, anxiety not only persists, but is growing. The World Health Organization points out that, in recent years, there has been a significant increase in anxiety disorders, affecting hundreds of millions of people around the world. This shows that the problem is not just a lack of control, but an excessive desire for control and an absence of real confidence. Jesus responds to this with a metaphor of rare sensitivity. He invites you to watch the birds. They don't cultivate, they don't store, they don't plan long production cycles, but they continue to be cared for. He points to the lilies of the field, which do not weave their garments, but are nevertheless clothed with beauty that surpasses that of any king. In doing so, he is not saying that faith eliminates difficulties, but that there is a more solid foundation than constant worry. There is a source that sustains, a care that does not fail, a Father who sees. The central point is not a denial of responsibility, but a redefinition of focus. What Jesus proposes is to replace restlessness with alignment with a greater purpose. Instead of running after what to eat, wear, and save, the call is to seek, above all, justice and the reality of the kingdom. And this is not as a theory, but as a daily practice. When this priority is established, other needs find a place within a healthier, more sensible, freer order. This change of focus directly impacts the way we live. Because when the mind is busy keeping track of all the variables, life loses lightness, presence, and meaning. Fear takes the place of creativity. Comparison steals gratitude. Scarcity becomes the filter through which everything is perceived. But when we learn to trust, when we recognize that personal value does not depend on performance, then we open up space to live more truthfully. There is something deeply liberating in this teaching, knowing that one is not alone, that one does not need to prove one's worth, that there is a care that precedes effort, that the Creator, who designed the details of nature, is not indifferent to human fragility. This care does not mean the absence of challenges, but a constant presence in the midst of them. And that changes everything. Trust, in this context, is not passivity. It is the willingness to walk lightly, to let go of what imprisons us, to give up the demand for absolute control. It is allowing what is essential to be enough. That today has its importance without being suffocated by tomorrow. That the value of life is not defined by unattainable goals, but by the peace that comes from surrender. When everything is placed side by side, the words that challenged empires, the ethics that inverted established values, the call to integrity of heart, the invitation to mercy, and the proposal of a trust that liberates, what emerges is not a set of rules, but a transformative vision of existence. Each teaching leads to a single, silent, unavoidable question. What is your life being built on? Throughout his speech, Jesus did not propose a religion, but rather a way of being in the world. He did not call us into a system, but out of everything that limits, corrupts, or hardens. He revealed an internal structure capable of sustaining a person even when everything around them collapses. And that is what makes his words timeless. They do not need cultural adaptations because they already cross cultures. They do not age because they touch on something that does not change, the human need for meaning, truth, and direction. Each stretch of the mountain sheds light on a forgotten part of the soul. And in the end, Jesus does not ask for admiration. He demands a response. Because a life based only on appearance, control, or convenience cannot withstand the pressures of time. Storms do not choose their victims. They simply come. And when they come, everything that is not deeply rooted is swept away. The rock, in this teaching, is not an abstract concept. It is obedience put into practice. It is the courage to choose justice even when it is difficult. It is the gesture of love that insists, even without return. It is silence in the face of judgment and firmness in the face of uncertainty. Building on this foundation does not protect against impact, but it prevents collapse. There is a difference between knowing the words and allowing them to shape every decision. And perhaps the real challenge is this: living coherently in a world that values masks. Remaining faithful to an inner truth when everything pushes towards superficiality. Loving without depending on the answer. Trusting without having all the guarantees. Forgiving without calculating the merits. The Sermon on the Mount ends as it began, without spectacle, without grandiose promises, just with the proposal of a path. A narrow path, yes, but firm. That does not depend on favorable circumstances, but on a constant willingness to remain rooted in what remains. No matter how many voices try to distract, confuse, or delay, the rock is there, accessible, available, real. And for those who decide to build on it, each choice has eternal weight, because nothing that is planted in this soil is wasted. No tear, no act of forgiveness, no silent decision to do good goes unnoticed. Everything finds meaning, everything gains depth, everything points to a life that is not driven by fear, but by the conviction that there is something greater sustaining everything. If the storm comes, and it will, may there be something beneath our feet that will not move. May faith not be just a memory, but a living practice. May truth not be a theory, but a foundation. May love not be a discourse, but a concrete action. And may the heart, free from unnecessary weight, remain firm, always. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.